So I've been in Italy for about a week now, and I thought it would be a really good time to review the images I've shot. And also in this video, I want to go over how I select my best images, because although it's subjective whether you think an image is good or not, there are some fairly standard things that a lot of photographers use to decide whether an image is really good or just average or not worth showing at all. Because I think editing's an often overlooked part of the photography process, and perhaps one of the most important parts, because you can diminish the impact of your best images by showing too many images. You can also lose the attention of your audience. For example, if you're showing some photos from a holiday to a friend, you need to do them a favor by selecting just your best images, to give an image up to 5 stars depending on how good I think it is. And I can also use the selection system to flag images that I want to keep as a group to show. So here are all the landscape images I shot over the last week, and although there are over 500 images, most of them actually aren't meant to be seen. So in Lightroom I can click on the 1 star, and that narrows it down to just the selected images, and I can step up through this star rating system to get up to my 4-star image, which I'll come back to later and talk about why I've given this 4 stars. But even if you don't have a star rating system, if you have a much simpler program, you can flag images with a favorite, and that's often good enough to just narrow it down to only the images you want to show. The other way to do it is just to make a collection of your favorite images. So with that in mind, let's jump into a few images, and I'll discuss why I've given the images the ratings I have. So here are my selected images. I have done some processing on all of these images because it's much easier to evaluate images when you've got the tonal adjustment where you want it. I want to start with a couple of images that were shot within a few minutes of each other and are very similar, these two here. So the one on the right is a more straightforward panorama, but I think it really works as an image because it suits this panoramic format, because it makes the landscape feel, really vast, and a panoramic format is probably closer to what the eye sees. It's also got early morning sunlight, about 7:15 in the morning, and it's coming from the side, so that's always quite dramatic in a landscape because the shadows really bring out the shapes of the landscape. I have actually polarized this image, so I've put a polarizing filter on the lens, and that helps reduce a little bit of the atmospheric haze, but doesn't remove it completely. The polarizing filter also deepens the blue sky a bit, and the greens tend to be more intense, so it really helps in this situation. So the other things I like about this image, it does have a point of interest, which is this house here, which has a subtle red roof. It's got kind of a leading line in that if you go through from the foreground to the house, down the valley, off into the hazy horizon. So that helps kind of lead the eye through the image. Apart from that, it's just a nice simple image with lots of things to look at. There's nothing distracting on the edge of the frame. I've given this a rating of 2, so it's quite a good image, but then a few meters to the side of this image, I shot this one here, which is essentially the same framing, except I've included this tree in the foreground, and I think this is the stronger image because it has more impact. That tree in the foreground, which is almost silhouetted, gives the image much more of a sense of depth because the foreground is really close to the camera, and it's quite sharp and high contrast, and the leading line is even more pronounced as it goes off from this tree, the house, to the valley and off into the distance. So you get a nice sense of being able to move in and through the image, and there's nothing too distracting in the sides of the image. There's a building over here on the side, but that's not too distracting. So it's got all the elements of the previous image except the panoramic format, but the added impact of that tree I think just makes this image a little bit more interesting, a little bit stronger. So this image has quite high impact because I've shot into the sun, which creates quite high contrast and semi-silhouettes the objects in the image. I've got a point of interest, which is this church in the left-hand side of the image. I've also got some interesting clouds which provide a bit of texture and detail. Overall, the image has high impact because of the high contrast and also the depth of the image, with the foreground semi-silhouetted leaves leading you through the image through to that church, and the sun just creating a sense of impact. It can be difficult to get the exposure right for shots like this when you're shooting into the sun, but it can create quite a high impact image. So I've given this a rating of 3 because I think it's one of my better images. And here's an image that I quite liked, but I knew that the sun wasn't quite in the right position. I really wanted the sun highlighting the village in the background to give it the maximum impact. I quite like that I've got this out of focus trees in the foreground which leads your eye into the image, but I waited a few minutes for this one, and the next shot I took, the sunlight has reached the village, and I think it has much more impact because your eye goes straight to that brightest point. I want to talk about this image here because it was one of the first images that I gave a very high rating first off, because it's an image I want to come back to. If we have a look at it without the cropping, you can see that it's actually a really wide format image. In fact, it's a 360 degree image taken by a drone just on sunset with a stormy sky. So I'm not sure where I want to crop this image, how much I want to include. Do I want to include just a tight crop such as this, which shows a point of interest, the building, which is nicely lit, and a stormy sky in the background? Or do I want to show more a panorama format, which includes much more of the landscape and maybe even the sunset? So I'm not sure about where to go with this image. So it was a good one to flag as a very good image, but one I will come back to. The other reason I'll come back to it is this is actually a JPEG image, a fairly low quality JPEG generated by the drone. And it does have some of the downsides of JPEG, such as the sun area is a bit burnt out and there's some JPEG artifacting around the clouds. The original shots were saved as RAW files, so I will be able to go to those RAW files and generate another panorama of much higher quality, but it will take a fair bit more work, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time on the images initially. I usually do a first pass, second pass, maybe even a third pass of editing, and the first pass really is to make decisions quickly, decide which ones you want to spend more time editing on, but don't overdo it in the first pass. So that image there, probably one of my strongest images from the week. I also have a few images here that were taken on a walk in the hills with our host Simone, and although I've given them some ratings, because they're taken around the middle of the day, they're not particularly strong images, but I wanted to include them because at the very least you want a record of where you've been and what you've done. I also tried some close-ups, but the lens I have is not greatly suited for close-ups in that you can't get very close to subjects. But I got a few that I think were worth keeping. So if we have a look at this image here, it's not a particularly strong image. The lighting's fairly flat and uninteresting, but I have tried to keep the main subject nice and sharp and throw the rest of the composition out of focus, so it concentrates more on this flower. You can see here the wildflowers growing in the forest. Harsh sunlight or bright sunlight is actually very difficult to work with photographing in the forest because the contrast is so high, but you can make some interesting compositions by trying to move around and line up dark and light areas, and so it can work as a composition. This is not a particularly strong image, but I do like how this plant and the foreground is nicely lit and reasonably separated, and that's the point that's in focus. Everything else is slightly out of focus. So it's just a wee collection of images that tell a little story, and that can be quite useful for showing friends or family where you've been. For this image here, I was first attracted by the lighting and the tree growing out of the middle of the derelict building. When I come across something like this, I like to have a really good walk around and take some variations. So once I got this image, I tried to see what else I could make of it, and I came up with a few images. So one more straight on, and the reason I quite like this straight on image is the windows and doorways create a real kind of interesting set of shapes and patterns, which is broken up by the tree growing out of the middle. It's quite a simple image, not particularly strong. This image here is in a particular style that I'm really interested in at the moment, which is high contrast street scenes, usually in bright sunlight, which causes part of the image, or I expose the image so that a lot of it is just goes to very dark shadow. But I find these sort of images really interesting, and I hope to do more of them. This area we're in, or even Italy in general, is really suited to this sort of photography because of the narrow streets, the really old textured buildings, and sunlight often coming down the streets. So this image, for me, works, I think, because there's a point of interest, which is the cyclist going through the scene, which adds a bit of narrative. There's also a leading line in that if you follow the cyclist into the light down the street, you can move through the image. The high contrast nature of it, the very black shadows and the bright sunlight, creates a bit of drama. I quite like the way these decorations up in the upper part of the street are backlit and highlit, and there's nice little details in the windows. So not a really strong image, but one that I'm certainly happy with, and have given a 1 or 2 star rating.